You are grounded until you apologize to your brother. My father Richard screamed this at me in the middle of his 40th wedding anniversary. 50 guests fell silent, holding their champagne flutes. My brother Preston smirked. My sister-in-law Nia suppressed a giggle. I was 34 years old, standing in the home my grandfather built, and my father was treating me like a rebellious teenager. I simply nodded and walked away. They thought they had won. They did not know that by grounding me, my father had just violated the one legal clause that kept a roof over his head. When his lawyer walked in the next morning trembling and holding the deed to the mansion, my father finally realized that he was not the king of this castle. He was just a guest who had overstayed his welcome. My name is Ethan. At 34 years old, I became an expert at two things: restoring priceless 18th century oil paintings and being invisible in my own family. Growing up in Newport, Rhode Island meant living in a museum where appearance was everything. To the outside world, the Sterling family was royalty. Inside those marble walls, it was a war zone, and I was the casualty. Before I tell you how I evicted my own father from the mansion he thought he owned, please hit like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments if you have ever been treated like a stranger in your own home. It started last Saturday. The sprawling lawn of our ancestral estate was manicured to perfection for my parents' anniversary. I pulled my dusty Ford truck into the long driveway. I had just driven 6 hours from a restoration job in Boston. Before I could even turn off the engine, my father was tapping aggressively on my window. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was. He pointed a manicured finger toward the service entrance. "Move this eyesore," he hissed. "We have senators arriving in 10 minutes, Ethan." "I do not want this junk parked next to Preston's Porsche." I looked past him. My brother Preston and his wife Nia were stepping out of a rented convertible. Nia adjusted her designer sunglasses and looked at my truck with pure disgust. Preston waved at me with a mocking grin before tossing his keys to the valet. The valet, who happened to be my high school friend, looked embarrassed for me. I did as I was told. I parked behind the kitchen next to the catering vans. When I walked toward the main entrance, my father blocked the doorway with his arm. "Not this way," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You smell like turpentine and failure. Use the servants' entrance." And Ethan put this on. He shoved a white waiter jacket into my chest. "If you are going to be here, you might as well make yourself useful, since you did not contribute a dime to this party." I stood there holding the stiff white jacket. Nia walked by, trailing the scent of expensive perfume. She stopped and looked down at my work boots, which had a speck of dried blue paint on the toe. She did not speak to me. She just wrinkled her nose and whispered to Preston loud enough for me to hear. "I hope he does not touch the food with those hands." My father laughed. A short, cruel bark of a laugh. "Put the jacket on, Ethan, or get back in your truck and leave." I put the jacket on. I swallowed my pride one last time. I did not know that in less than 4 hours I would be taking it off for good and taking the house with it. I balanced a heavy silver tray of champagne flutes, weaving through the crowd of senators and local celebrities. I was invisible to them, just a waiter in a sea of tuxedos, but my father had eyes like a hawk. He spotted me near the ice sculpture and clamped his hand on my shoulder. His grip was tight enough to bruise. "Not here," he muttered through a fake smile, waving at a judge passing by. We walked into the library, the only room in the house that still smelled like my grandfather. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and expensive bourbon. Richard did not waste time on pleasantries. He turned on me, his face flushed with alcohol. "I need you to sign a check from the Silas Trust Maintenance Fund. Tonight, $150,000. I stared at him. The maintenance fund was strictly for repairs. The slate roof was leaking in the east wing, and the foundation needed shoring up. "Dad, the roof is rotting," I said, keeping my voice calm. "We cannot touch that principal. It is illegal, and you know it." Richard waved his hand dismissively, as if the law was just a suggestion. "The roof can wait. Your brother has an opportunity, a tech startup in Silicon Valley. It is a sure thing, Ethan. He needs seed money to get in on the ground floor." I almost laughed out loud. A sure thing. Just like the organic dog food truck that cost the family $40,000? or the cryptocurrency mining rig that caught fire in the garage and burned down the shed, or perhaps you mean the luxury car rental business that ended with 3 lawsuits. I set the tray down on the mahogany desk with a loud clatter. No. I said it clearly. I am the custodian of the trust, Dad. My job is to protect this house, not fund Preston's gambling addiction disguised as entrepreneurship. Richard's eyes bulged. He stepped closer, invading my personal space. How dare you? That money belongs to this family. You are just the keeper of the keys, Ethan. Do not forget your place. The heavy oak door creaked open. Preston walked in, loosening his bow tie. He had been listening outside. Of course he had. He looked at Dad, then at me with that familiar pout that had gotten him out of trouble since he was 5 years old. See, Dad? Preston whined, his voice dripping with calculated self-pity. I told you he would sabotage me. He is jealous. He wants me to fail so he can feel better about being a glorified janitor. Preston got in my face, smelling of scotch and entitlement. You think you are better than me because you hoard Grandpa's money? That deal closes tomorrow, Ethan. If I miss this buy-in, it is on your head. You are ruining my life on purpose. Nia slipped into the room behind him, crossing her arms. Oh, poor Preston, she cooed, glaring at me. Your brother just does not understand ambition, honey. He is content playing with dust and paint thinner while you try to build an empire. My father slammed his hand on the desk, making the antique lamp rattle. Enough, he roared. You will write that check, Ethan, or you will regret it. I picked up the tray again. I regret a lot of things, Dad, I said, walking toward the door. Like not changing the locks years ago. But I am not writing that check. Preston threw his glass against the wall, shattering it just inches from my head. You will pay for this, Ethan, he screamed. You have no idea what you just started. The sound of shattering crystal was louder than a gunshot. It cut through the jazz music and the polite chatter in the hallway, instantly killing the mood of the party. Suddenly, the library door was no longer a barrier. It was a stage, and the 50 guests outside were the audience. Richard saw them. He saw the senator staring with a half-eaten shrimp in his hand. He saw the bank CEO frowning. In that split second, my father made a choice. He could not look like a man who had lost control of his family. He had to be the alpha. He had to be the disciplinarian. He grabbed my arm and dragged me out of the library into the grand foyer, right under the massive crystal chandelier. His face was a mask of righteous indignation. Look at him, everyone, Richard announced, his voice booming off the marble floors. My 34-year-old son. The disappointment. He refuses to help his own brother because he is too busy playing with paintbrushes in the guest house I allow him to live in. I tried to pull my arm away, but he dug his fingernails into my bicep. You are a freeloader, Ethan. He spat the words out like venom. A parasite. You eat my food, you use my electricity, and you contribute nothing. Absolutely nothing. I stood there feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. Not because I was ashamed, but because I was angry. I wanted to scream that I paid the property taxes last year when he claimed he was illiquid. I wanted to scream that the food he was eating was paid for by the dividends I managed. But I said nothing. I just looked him in the eye. That silence infuriated him more than any shout could have. He wanted a fight. He wanted me to cry or beg so he could feel powerful. When I did not give him that satisfaction, he decided to take everything else. He turned to the crowd, gesturing at me like I was a criminal. He thinks he is a man, Richard shouted, but he acts like a petulant child. And children need to be disciplined. He held out his hand, palm up. Give me your phone. Now. And the keys to that truck. I stared at him in disbelief. I am 34 years old, Dad. I said, my voice steady. You cannot be serious. Oh, I am deadly serious, he sneered, stepping closer until I could smell the stale alcohol on his breath. As long as you live under my roof, you follow my rules. You are grounded, Ethan. A ripple of nervous laughter went through the crowd. They thought he was joking. Being grounded at 34 was absurd. But Richard was not laughing. I said, you are grounded. You are forbidden to leave this estate. You will go to your room in the guest house and you will stay there. No internet, no phone, No truck. You will sit there and think about your selfishness until you are ready to write that check and apologize to your brother on your knees. Do it now or I will have security throw you out on the street with nothing but the clothes on your back. Preston leaned against the library door frame, smirking as he swirled his drink. Better listen to Dad, little brother, he called out. You know he means it. Nia pulled out her phone and started recording. I could see the red light blinking. This was it. The moment they thought broke me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone and keys. I dropped them into my father's open hand. They made a heavy clinking sound in the silent room. The laughter that followed was not just a sound, it was a physical weight pressing down on me. My Uncle Bob, who had borrowed $5,000 from me last year and never paid it back, was chuckling the loudest, shaking his head as if I was the family embarrassment. But the worst was Nia. She was having the time of her life. She circled me with her phone, holding it up like a trophy. I could see myself on her screen, a distorted digital version of a man being stripped of his dignity. She narrated in that fake, sweet voice she used for her followers. Look, everyone, this is what happens when you disrespect your elders. 34 and still getting grounded, so embarrassing. She shoved the camera closer to my face. Say hi to the internet, Ethan. Tell them how it feels to be a naughty little boy. My father looked around the room, soaking up the approval of his guests. He felt powerful. He felt in control. He had no idea that he had just handed me the weapon I needed. By publicly restricting my movement and confiscating my property in front of 50 witnesses, he had just committed what the trust documents defined as abusive conduct by a life tenant. I did not cry. I did not beg. I felt a cold calm settle over me. It was the clarity of a surgeon about to make the first incision. I looked Richard dead in the eye. The room went quiet, waiting for my tantrum. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to give them a show. Instead, I gave them silence. I looked at the keys in his hand, then I looked at the exit. You want me to stay put? I asked quietly. You want me to be confined to my room? Richard sneered and pointed a finger at my chest. I want you to learn your place, Ethan. Now go. I nodded slowly. All right, Dad. You want me to disappear? I will disappear. I turned my back on him. I ignored Nia, who was still filming. I ignored Preston, who was making loser signs with his hand. I walked straight out the service door without looking back. As I stepped into the cool night air, I took a deep breath. They thought they had locked me in. They did not realize they had just locked themselves out of the only future they had. I walked to the guest house not as a prisoner, but as an executioner, preparing the final blow. The party continued inside, loud and boisterous, but for me the silence was heavy with promise. I was not going to sleep tonight. I had a war to win. 10 minutes after I entered the guest house, I heard the heavy click of the deadbolt sliding into place from the outside. My father had actually done it. He had ordered Miller, the night security guard, to lock me in. I saw Miller's flashlight beams sweep across my window, and I heard him mutter an apology before walking away. My father thought he was punishing a child. He thought I would spend the night crying into my pillow or pounding on the door, begging for forgiveness. He was wrong. He had given me exactly what I needed. Silence and time. I did not turn on the main lights. I worked by the glow of my desk lamp. I did not pack clothes. I left my shirts in the closet and my toothbrush in the bathroom. If everything went according to plan, I would not need them. Instead, I pulled 3 heavy banker's boxes from under my bed. These were not filled with junk. They contained 10 years of ammunition. I methodically packed the restoration logs, every invoice for the slate roof repair I had paid for with my own money, every receipt for the plumbing in the West Wing that Richard claimed he fixed, but actually spent the money on golf trips. I packed the high-resolution scans of the original architectural blueprints, which proved that the alterations Preston made to the garage were structurally unsafe and illegal. My father thought I was just painting pictures in here. He did not know I was documenting his systematic destruction of the family legacy. Then came the most important piece. I walked over to the fireplace where a small portrait of my grandfather Silas hung. My father let me keep it because he thought it was a worthless copy. He was a fool, who did not know art. I took the painting down and laid it face down on my desk. Using a small knife, I carefully sliced the paper backing. Taped to the wooden frame was a small silver USB drive. This was the insurance policy Grandpa gave me 3 days before he died. It contained video files and digital records that Richard never knew existed. I held the cold metal in my hand. For years I had hesitated to use it because he was my father. But tonight when he locked that door, he ceased to be my father. He became a liability. The clock on the wall struck 2 in the morning. The party sounds from the main house had finally died down. My mobile phone was in my father's pocket, but in his arrogance, he had forgotten about the old copper landline in the kitchen. It was an independent line that did not go through the main switchboard. I picked up the receiver and dialed a number I had memorized a decade ago. It rang twice before a groggy but sharp voice answered. "Henderson here. It is time," I said quietly. There was a pause on the other end, then the rustle of bed sheets and the click of a lamp turning on. "Are you sure, Ethan? Once we pull this trigger, there is no going back. The family will be destroyed." I looked at the locked door. I looked at the boxes of evidence. He locked me in Henderson. He confiscated my property and restricted my movement in front of 50 witnesses. He violated the conduct clause of the life estate. I heard Henderson exhale a long breath. Then he just evicted himself. "I will have the papers drawn up within the hour. I will see you at breakfast. Do not sleep. We have a war to start." The morning sun over Newport was blindingly bright, but my father woke up in a dark mood. He nursed a hangover from the anniversary champagne, but the anticipation of crushing my spirit was the only cure he needed. He marched across the dew-covered lawn toward the guest house like a general inspecting captured territory. He had rehearsed his speech while shaving. He was going to make me beg. He planned to make me walk back to the main house and apologize to Preston in front of the maids, just to drive the humiliation home. He signaled to Miller, the security guard, who looked tired and uncomfortable. "Open it," Richard commanded, tapping his foot impatiently against the stone step. Miller fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking slightly under my father's glare. The heavy deadbolt slid back with a loud clank. Richard did not knock. He threw the door open so hard it banged against the interior wall. "Well, Ethan," he boomed, stepping into the threshold, his voice designed to intimidate. "Have you learned your lesson yet? Are you ready to sign that check, or should I leave you in here for another 24 hours without food?" He expected to see me slumped on the bed or sitting sullenly in the corner. He expected resistance or tears. Instead, he was met with absolute silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy and wrong. Richard stepped further into the room and his confident stride faltered. The air was stale. The familiar smell of turpentine and linseed oil that usually permeated my living space was gone. He looked around in confusion. The easel that had stood by the north window for 10 years was missing. The bookshelves, which had been overflowing with art history volumes and restoration manuals, were bare. The closet door stood wide open, revealing nothing but wire hangers swinging gently in the draft. It was as if I had never existed. The room had been scrubbed clean with surgical precision. Panic began to rise in his chest, but he pushed it down. "He is hiding," Richard muttered to himself. "He is playing games." He checked the small bathroom. Empty. He checked under the bed. Empty. Then his eyes landed on the bed itself. The mattress was stripped of its linens. Sitting perfectly in the center of the bare mattress was a small, neat pile. Richard walked over to it slowly. It was the white waiter jacket he had forced me to wear the night before. I had folded it with military precision, the creases sharp and exacting. Resting on top of the jacket was a single piece of heavy cardstock from my personal stationery. Richard picked it up. There was no long letter, no emotional rant, just one word written in my distinct calligraphy. Returned. My father crushed the note in his fist. He spun around looking at the windows. They were still locked from the inside. The door had been deadbolted from the outside. "How did he get out?" Richard yelled at Miller, who was cowering in the doorway. "You fell asleep. You let him out." "I did not," Sir Miller stammered. "I was here all night. I swear. The windows are painted shut. There is no other exit." Richard looked back at the empty room. For the first time, fear flickered behind his eyes. He realized that I had not just escaped a room. I had dismantled my entire life right under his nose, and I had done it without making a sound. He was not dealing with a rebellious son anymore. He was dealing with a ghost, and ghosts are impossible to control. Richard stormed back into the main house, clutching the note that said returned. His face was a mask of confusion that was quickly hardening into rage. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the smartphone he had confiscated from me the night before. He jabbed at the screen, expecting to see my location, or perhaps a desperate text message begging for forgiveness. The screen remained black. I had remotely bricked the device 3 hours ago using my laptop. It was now nothing more than an expensive paperweight. With a growl of frustration, Richard hurled the phone across the foyer, where it skidded harmlessly across the marble floor. He marched to the wall-mounted intercom and pressed the button for the guest house. He mashed it repeatedly, demanding an answer, but only static hissed back. He grabbed his own cell phone and dialed the landline extension in the guest house. It rang and rang, echoing in the empty room he had just left. For the first time, Richard realized he had no way to reach me. He had taken my means of communication to punish me, but in doing so, he had cut off his only line of control. Nia was already in the living room, lounging on the silk sofa with her tablet. She was trying to find footage from the night before to edit into her next social media post. She wanted a clip of me walking to the guest house, looking defeated. She tapped the icon for the home security app, expecting to scroll through the timeline. Instead, the screen flashed a bright blue loading bar, followed by a stark white message. "System initialization. Please set up admin password." She frowned and tapped the screen harder. "What is wrong with the Wi-Fi?" she whined. "Richard, look at this. The cameras are not loading. It says the system is in factory mode." Richard froze. He knew the security system was hardwired. It did not just reset on its own. He walked over and looked at the tablet. Every single camera feed was gone. The archives were wiped. 10 years of surveillance footage, including the recordings of my father shouting at me the previous night, had vanished. Someone had physically accessed the main server in the basement and held the hard reset button for 30 seconds. Before Richard could process the implications of a blind house, a shout erupted from the kitchen. It was Preston. It was not a shout of anger, but of pure panic. "Dad, you need to come here now," Preston yelled, his voice cracking. Richard and Nia ran into the kitchen. Preston was standing over his laptop, his face pale and sweating. His hands were trembling as he pointed at the banking portal on the screen. "I tried to transfer the seed money," Preston stammered. "The investors need the wire by noon today or the deal is dead. I logged into the maintenance fund like you told me to, but look." Richard leaned in. The account balance was visible, showing a healthy 6 figures. But right above the numbers in bold red letters was a notification that made Richard's blood run cold. "Account frozen. Suspicious activity detected. Contact primary custodian for authorization." Preston slammed his fist on the granite counter. "It says contact custodian. That is Ethan. He froze the account, Dad. He locked us out." Richard stared at the screen. The reality of the situation began to sink in. I was not just a missing son. I was the person who held the passwords, the keys, and the authority. By leaving the house, I had not just disappeared. I had taken the brains of the estate with me, leaving them inside a shell that was rapidly shutting down around them. The house was not just a building anymore. It was a machine, and I had just pulled the plug. Despite the chaos erupting in the kitchen, Richard forced everyone into the formal dining room. He insisted on maintaining the routine, as if sitting at the head of the table would somehow restore his authority. The maids moved silently, pouring coffee with trembling hands, sensing the tension in the air. Preston stared at his plate of cold eggs, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. Nia was aggressively typing on her phone, trying to delete the humiliating comments that were starting to appear on her social media feed. Richard took a sip of black coffee and slammed the cup down. Stop panicking, he ordered, his voice tight. It is just a technical glitch. Ethan does not have the courage to lock us out permanently. He has no money. He has no connections. He is probably sitting in a diner down the road waiting for me to call him. He will come crawling back by dinner time when he realizes he cannot survive without my credit cards. Preston looked up, his face pale. But Dad, the account says frozen. That is not a glitch. That is a deliberate action. What if he went to the lawyers? Richard cut him off with a glare. I am the patriarch of this family, Preston. Lawyers listen to me, not to a glorified handyman. Eat your breakfast. The heavy double doors of the dining room burst open. It was not a servant. It was the event manager from the catering company that had handled the anniversary party. He was a man who was usually obsequious and smiling, but today his face was red with anger. A flustered maid tried to hold him back, but he brushed past her. Mr. Sterling, we have a problem, the manager announced, ignoring the etiquette of the room. Richard stood up, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. How dare you barge in here? Send the bill to my accountant and get out. I did run the bill, the manager snapped, holding up a portable card reader. And I tried your personal black card. And the corporate expense card. They were all declined, every single one of them. The room went dead silent. Nia stopped typing. Richard laughed, a nervous disbelief coloring his tone. That is impossible. Run it again. I ran it 5 times, the manager shouted, losing his patience. The bank says the cards have been reported as compromised, and the assets are frozen by the primary trustee. I have a crew of 20 people outside waiting to be paid for 16 hours of labor. I have a $30,000 invoice for the food and the vintage champagne you ordered. I am not leaving until I get paid, Mr. Sterling. Richard reached for his wallet, but his hands were shaking. He pulled out another card, a backup he kept for emergencies. Try this one, he commanded. The manager swiped it. The machine beeped a harsh, long tone. Declined. You have to be kidding me, Richard whispered, staring at the little plastic rectangle. I am done playing games, the manager said, stepping closer to the table. You have 10 minutes to produce $30,000 in cash or a certified check. If not, I am calling the police and reporting this as theft of services. And I will make sure every vendor in Newport knows that the Sterling family cannot pay their bills. Richard looked at Preston. Preston looked at Nia. For the first time in their lives, the wealthy Sterling family realized they did not have enough cash on hand to buy a gallon of milk, let alone pay for the party they had thrown to celebrate themselves. Ethan had not just cut off the money, he had cut off their reputation. The argument with the catering manager was cut short by the sound of heavy tires crunching on the gravel driveway. It was not the sound of a delivery truck or a guest. It was the distinct rhythmic approach of a convoy. Richard rushed to the window, pushing the curtains aside. 3 black SUVs had pulled up in a formation that looked more like a federal raid than a social call. The lead vehicle had the seal of the county sheriff on the door. Richard felt a surge of relief mixed with confusion. He assumed that I had finally been arrested. He assumed the police were bringing me back in handcuffs for stealing the family car. Or perhaps for some other imagined crime he could pin on me. He straightened his tie and smoothed his hair. Watch this, he told the catering manager with a sneer. The authorities are here. My son is about to learn that he cannot just walk away from his responsibilities. Richard marched out the front door and stood on the top step of the porch. He crossed his arms, waiting for the officers to drag me out of the back seat. But the back door of the middle SUV opened, and it was not me who stepped out. It was Mr. Henderson. Henderson was a man made of sharp angles and colder logic. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Preston's car, and he held a thick leather briefcase. Beside him stood Sheriff Miller, the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the county. They walked up the driveway with a purpose that made Richard step back involuntarily. What is the meaning of this? Richard shouted, trying to regain the offensive. I did not call you Henderson, and I certainly did not call the sheriff. If this is about Ethan, I want him charged with theft. He stole sensitive family documents. Henderson stopped at the bottom of the stairs. He looked up at Richard not with respect, but with the detached pity of an undertaker viewing a body. He adjusted his glasses and spoke in a voice that cut through the morning air like a knife. "Good morning, Richard. We are not here to arrest your son. In fact, Ethan is currently safe in a secure location reviewing the estate financials." Richard turned red. "Then get off my property. You are fired, Henderson. I will have your license for this. Sheriff, remove this man for trespassing." The sheriff did not move. He rested his hand on his belt and looked at Richard with a stone face. "I cannot do that, Mr. Sterling. Mr. Henderson is acting on behalf of the legal owner of this estate." Richard laughed a sound that was bordering on hysterical. "I am the owner. I am Richard Sterling." Henderson took a step up the stairs. "No, Richard. You are not. You never were." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a document with a red seal. "I am not here to visit you. I am here to enforce Clause 9 of the Silas Sterling Trust. The clause regarding the misconduct of a life tenant. You might want to sit down. This is going to be a very short conversation." Henderson opened the leather folder. The sound of heavy paper rustling was the only noise in the driveway. Richard stood on the porch looking down at the lawyer with a mixture of arrogance and rising unease. Nia and Preston had come out to stand behind him like a royal court backing up their king. Henderson adjusted his glasses and began to read, not to Richard, but to the air itself, establishing the facts for the record. "You are operating under a fatal misconception, Richard. You seem to believe you inherited this estate when your father Silas passed away 10 years ago. You did not. Silas knew about your gambling debts. He knew about your inability to manage capital. He loved you because you were his son, but he did not trust you with his legacy. So he bypassed you completely." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but Henderson held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "The house was left to the Silas Sterling Trust. You were granted what is known as a life estate. It gave you the right to reside here until your death, but it was not a gift. It was a contract. And like all contracts, it came with strict conditions. Clause 9 states that because this estate houses an art collection valued at over $50 million, a certified custodian must reside on the property at all times to ensure their preservation." Preston scoffed from the doorway. "So what? We will hire a maid to dust the paintings. Who cares?" Henderson ignored him and kept his eyes locked on Richard. "The custodian is not a job title you can fill from a temp agency. It is a specific person named irrevocably in the trust. The designated custodian is your son Ethan. The trust stipulates that if the custodian is removed, harassed, or prevented from performing his duties, the life estate is immediately voided to protect the assets." The color drained from Richard's face. He remembered signing the papers 10 years ago, but he had never bothered to read the fine print. He had just assumed Ethan was there to be his servant. Henderson pointed a finger at Richard, delivering the final blow. "Last night, in front of 50 witnesses, you confiscated the custodian's communication devices. You restricted his movement. You publicly humiliated him and created a hostile environment that forced him to vacate the premises to protect the integrity of his position. You thought you were grounding a child, Richard. In reality, you were firing your landlord. By driving Ethan away, you triggered the automatic termination of your own rights. You are no longer the master of this house. As of 6 o'clock this morning, when Ethan filed the breach of contract, you became a trespasser in a home that now belongs entirely to the trust. And since Ethan is the sole beneficiary of that trust, you are now trespassing in his house." Henderson reached into his briefcase one last time and pulled out a document that looked terrifyingly official. It was stapled in blue legal backing and stamped with today's date. He did not hand it to Richard. He handed it to the sheriff, who then formally served Richard by placing it firmly in his trembling hand. "This is a notice to quit." Henderson stated, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "Since the life estate has been voided due to your breach of the custodian clause, you are now occupying this property without a lease or title. The trust is exercising its right to reclaim possession. You and your extended family have 72 hours to vacate the premises. That means by Tuesday at 9 in the morning, this house must be empty of all personal effects, and all keys must be surrendered to the sheriff." Richard stared at the paper. 72 hours. It was not enough time to pack 30 years of hoarding, let alone find a new place to live, that matched his delusions of grandeur. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. He was broke, he was homeless, and he was being kicked out by the son he had called a failure just 12 hours ago. He knew he could not fight Henderson with logic. He had no money for a lawyer. So Richard did what he always did when cornered. He decided to play the victim. He dropped the papers on the porch steps. His left hand flew up to clutch his chest, and he let out a strangled gasp that was a little too theatrical. "My heart," he groaned loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the neighbors. "Oh God, my heart is giving out. You are killing me, Henderson. You are killing a sick old man." He slumped against the doorframe, sliding down slowly until he was sitting on the porch mat, breathing heavily. It was a performance worthy of a daytime soap opera. Nia immediately seized the moment. She threw herself down beside him, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Look what you have done! You have induced a heart attack! This is murder!" She looked up at the sheriff, her eyes wild with manufactured outrage. "You cannot evict a dying man. This is a violation of his human rights. The Geneva Convention protects people from this kind of torture. We have rights. We have rights to shelter and dignity." Preston stood there looking useless, shifting his weight from foot to foot, unsure if he should call an ambulance or join the performance. Henderson watched the scene with a look of utter boredom. He checked his watch. He had seen Richard play golf for 6 hours straight just last week without breaking a sweat. Sheriff Henderson said calmly, "Please call paramedics. If Mr. Sterling is having a genuine medical emergency, he needs to be transported to the hospital immediately. That will actually expedite the eviction process, since he cannot return here anyway. And if the paramedics determine he is faking it to obstruct a court order, I believe that constitutes resisting a civil judgment." Richard's groans stopped abruptly. He opened one eye to look at Henderson. The lawyer smiled a thin, shark-like smile. "You have 71 hours and 50 minutes left, Richard. I suggest you stop acting and start packing. The clock is ticking, and unlike your son, the trust has zero patience for drama." Preston stepped forward, his face red with a mix of embarrassment and entitlement. He looked from his father sitting on the porch mat to the sheriff standing with his arms crossed. The fear of losing his lifestyle overrode any common sense he had left. He pointed a shaking finger at Henderson, trying to summon the arrogance that usually worked for him at nightclubs and car dealerships. "You cannot just kick him out," Preston shouted, his voice cracking. "This is insane. He is the eldest son. He is the patriarch. Under state law, he is entitled to 50% of the estate assets, regardless of what some trust paper says. That is his birthright. You are trying to rob him just because Ethan is your favorite. We will sue you for theft of inheritance." Henderson sighed. It was a long, weary sound. He looked at Preston like a professor dealing with a particularly slow student who had not done the reading. He did not shout back. He simply reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick-bound ledger. It landed on the porch railing with a heavy thud that made Richard flinch. "Biology is not a bank account," Preston Henderson said calmly. "And birthright does not override simple math." He opened the ledger to the very first page, which was yellowed with age. "Here is the accounting from 10 years ago, immediately following the death of Silas Sterling. You are correct about one thing. Your father did inherit 50%. Preston smirked, crossing his arms. "See? I told you." Henderson held up a hand. "Let me finish. He inherited $2 million in cash and stocks separate from the real estate. That was his share." Henderson flipped the pages rapidly, the sound echoing in the silence. 2015. The failed restaurant venture in downtown Newport. $300,000 gone. 2017. The settlement payments for your 3 driving under the influence charges, Preston. Another $200,000. 2019. The gambling debts in Las Vegas and the purchase of luxury cars that depreciated instantly. Richard sat up straight on the porch mat, his fake heart attack completely forgotten. He stared at the book as if it were a venomous snake. He had spent years hiding these numbers from his wife and son, pretending the well was bottomless. Henderson flipped to the final page, which was covered in red ink. The inheritance ran dry 4 years ago. Since then, Richard has been borrowing against the equity of this house to maintain your lifestyle. He does not own 50% Preston. Currently, he owes the trust $450,000. Henderson slammed the book shut with a finality that made Nia jump. Your father is not an heir, he is a debtor, and by evicting him the trust is simply stopping the bleeding. He has spent his share, he has spent your mother's share, and he has spent a good portion of the money that should have gone to maintaining the roof over your heads. So no Preston. He owns nothing. In fact, if we liquidated his assets today, he would still be in the negative. Now, do you have any other legal theories you would like to discuss, or should we get back to the eviction? Nia Sterling was a predator who knew exactly when to change hunting grounds. She realized instantly that Henderson had them checkmated in the legal arena. The numbers in that ledger were irrefutable, and the sheriff was not going to be swayed by theatrical fainting spells. But Nia knew that the law was slow, and public opinion was fast. She looked at Richard, who was still slumped on the porch steps, looking defeated and small. To anyone else, he looked like a broken man. To Nia, he looked like the perfect prop for her next production. She pulled out her smartphone and wiped her dry eyes. If she could not keep the house, she would burn my reputation to the ground. She turned her back to the sheriff and opened her video editing app. She still had the footage from last night. The video of my father screaming at me and demanding I surrender my keys. But with a few expert swipes of her manicured finger, she cropped out Richard's aggression. She muted his shouting audio. She cut the clip to show only the moment I turned my back and walked away, leaving my father standing there with his hand outstretched. Without the context of his abuse, it looked like I was abandoning a pleading old man. She added a black and white filter to make the scene look somber. Then she hit the live button on her social media platform, where she had 50,000 followers who hung on her every word about fashion and lifestyle. She messed up her hair slightly to look distressed and let a single practiced tear roll down her cheek. "Hey guys," she whispered into the camera, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "I usually only share happy things here, but today is a nightmare. We are being thrown out on the street." My brother-in-law Ethan paused for dramatic effect, letting a sob escape. He manipulated the trust fund. He waited until Dad was sick and confused, and now he is evicting us. Look at him. She flipped the camera to show Richard, who instinctively hunched over, playing the part of the frail victim. He is 70 years old, guys. He has a heart condition, and his own son just laughed and told him to get out. We have nowhere to go. Please share this. We need help. We need a lawyer who can stop this monster. She ended the stream and looked up at Henderson with a look of pure malice. You might have the deed, she hissed. But I have the world watching. By tonight, Ethan will be the most hated man in Rhode Island. She was right about one thing. The video was already racking up views. But she was wrong about the outcome. She had just started a war she was not equipped to finish, because unlike her, I did not care about likes. I cared about the truth. The internet moves faster than justice. Within an hour, Nia's video had jumped from 50,000 views to 500,000. It was trending on every major platform, tagged with #ungratefulson and #SaveGrandpaRichard. I sat in the temporary office I had set up in a hotel room downtown, watching the destruction of my life unfold in real time. My phone began to buzz, not with text messages from friends, but with notifications from my business page. I had spent 10 years building a reputation as one of the most meticulous art restorers on the East Coast. My work required trust. Museums handed me canvases worth millions of dollars because they knew I was a man of integrity. But in the span of 60 minutes, that trust evaporated. I watched as my Google business profile was flooded with hundreds of one-star reviews from people who had never met me. They called me a monster. They accused me of elder abuse. They said I was a thief who was stealing a dying man's home. Then came the phone calls. The first one was from the curator of the Boston Fine Arts Museum. "Ethan," she said, her voice stiff and formal, "we have seen the video circulating online. Given the sensitive nature of our donors and the public outcry, we feel it is best to pause our current contract. Please return the Winslow Homer painting immediately. We will find another restorer." My stomach dropped. That contract was the biggest of my career. It was supposed to finance the new studio I was planning. I tried to explain. I tried to tell her it was a manipulated video, but she cut me off. Perception is reality, Ethan, she said. We cannot have a public relations nightmare attached to our upcoming exhibit. I am sorry. I hung up and stared at the screen. Another email popped up. A private collector canceling a consultation. Then another. My livelihood was being dismantled by a lie. Back at the mansion, Nia was beaming. She showed the comments to Richard, who was suddenly looking much better. See, Dad, she chirped. The world is on our side. We can start a GoFundMe legal defense fund. People are already asking where to donate. We could raise $50,000 by tonight. Richard sat up straighter, a smug grin returning to his face. You are a genius, Nia, he said. He thought he had found a loophole. He thought that if enough strangers on the internet hated me, the laws of the trust would somehow bend to his will. They did not understand that by dragging this into the public eye, they had not just attacked my character. They had invited scrutiny into their own lives. They thought they were the victims. They did not realize that when you turn on a spotlight to shame someone else, you also illuminate your own dirty secrets. I closed my laptop. The time for silence was over. If they wanted a public spectacle, I would give them one, but it would not be the story they expected. I did not log in to defend myself. I did not beg strangers for understanding. In the world of high stakes, litigation, silence is not weakness, it is the loading phase of a weapon. While Nia was busy refreshing her subscriber count and deleting negative comments about herself, I was sitting across from Henderson, finalizing a stack of documents that would turn her digital kingdom into a liability. We filed a lawsuit for defamation per se in the Superior Court. In Rhode Island, falsely accusing someone of a crime like elder abuse is actionable without proving damages. But since I had actual contracts canceled by the museum, the damages we were claiming were astronomical. We set the figure at $3 million. That was enough to bankrupt Nia 5 times over. But the lawsuit was just the opening salvo. The real kill shot was the subpoenas we served not to Nia, but to the 3 major fashion brands she represented as an influencer. We legally informed them that their brand ambassador was currently the defendant in a major fraud and defamation case involving the exploitation of a vulnerable senior. Corporate brands run from controversy faster than they run from taxes. We attached the unedited security footage as evidence. Then came the masterstroke. To prove that her statements were malicious lies, we filed a motion for full financial discovery. If she wanted to claim in court that I was a financial predator and she was the victim, she would have to open her books. We demanded the public release of all bank statements from the Sterling family for the last 5 years to prove exactly who had been paying the bills. This was the black swan event she never saw coming. Nia thought she was controlling the narrative with a 30-second clip. She did not realize that by dragging this into the public square, she had given me the legal right to publish the receipts. And I had receipts for everything. Her car lease, her credit card bills, even the designer dress she was wearing in her crying video. I had paid for all of it from the trust dividends she claimed I was stealing. The internet loves a villain, but they love an exposed hypocrite even more. I signed the final affidavit and handed it to Henderson. I told him to serve her immediately. I wanted to see how many likes she would get when her followers found out she was living on the money she claimed I stole. The subpoena required her to produce these documents within 48 hours or face a contempt of court charge. Nia wanted a reality show, so I decided to give her a dose of actual reality. Her sponsors were about to drop her, and her financial secrets were about to become public record. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The mansion was no longer a sanctuary, it had become a pressure cooker with the safety valve welded shut. The legal threats from Ethan were piling up on the hallway table, but the real danger was inside the living room. Richard paced back and forth wearing a path into the Persian rug, while Preston sat with his head in his hands. The silence broke when Richard finally found someone to blame for his downfall. It was never going to be himself, so he turned his sights on Preston. "You greedy parasite," Richard spat, kicking the leg of Preston's chair. "This is your fault. If you had not come begging for another $100,000 for that stupid startup, I would not have had to pressure Ethan. we would still be living comfortably. You and your endless failures cost me my home." Preston looked up, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "Do not put this on me, Dad. You are the one who grounded a 34-year-old man. You are the one who wanted to show off for the guests. I just asked for a loan. You turned it into a circus. How dare you speak to me like that?" Richard roared, his face turning purple. "I have supported you and your wife for years. I paid for your wedding. I paid for your cars. And this is how you repay me, by destroying my legacy." Nia laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that made both men freeze. She stood up from the sofa, and for the first time since she married into the family, she dropped the mask of the doting daughter-in-law. She looked at Richard with pure, unadulterated contempt. Her voice was no longer sweet. It was jagged and cruel. "Oh, shut up, Richard," Nia sneered, walking toward him. "You keep talking about this legacy like you actually built it. We all saw the lawyer's ledger. You are not a tycoon, you are a leech. You have been living off Grandpa Silas' money for a decade just like the rest of us. The only difference is you are arrogant enough to think you earned it." Richard gasped, clutching the back of the sofa for support. He had never heard Nia speak like this. "Get out," he whispered. "Get out of my house." "It is not your house," Nia shouted, getting right in his face. "That is the whole point, isn't it? It is Ethan's house. You are just a squatter, Richard. A broke, pathetic squatter who let his socially awkward son outsmart him. I married Preston because I thought this family had power. But look at you. You are nothing. You have no money. You have no influence. And in 48 hours you will be homeless." Richard raised his hand as if to strike her, but he froze when he saw the look in her eyes. It was a look of pure hatred. He lowered his hand, realizing he had lost control of everything. The grand alliance against Ethan had crumbled. Now it was every rat for themselves on a sinking ship. The house echoed with their screaming, turning the elegant rooms into a cage where three desperate people tore each other apart while the heat slowly faded from the radiators. The real hell was not being evicted. It was being trapped in there with each other. At exactly 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, the 72-hour grace period expired. I did not send a SWAT team to kick down the doors. I did not send the sheriff to drag them out in handcuffs. I simply made 2 phone calls, one to the electric company and one to the municipal water board. As the legal owner of the property and the account holder, I instructed them to suspend service immediately. The effect was instantaneous. In the master bathroom, Nia was midway through blow-drying her hair when the dryer whined and died. The lights in the vanity mirror blinked out, plunging her into the gray gloom of a cloudy morning. Downstairs, the low hum of the massive Sub-Zero refrigerator in the kitchen ceased. The silence that followed was heavy and unnatural. The mansion was no longer a living thing. It was a stone corpse. Richard marched to the thermostat and tapped the screen aggressively, but it was blank. The boiler system, which required electricity to pump hot water through the radiators, shuddered to a halt. The Newport estate was built in the 19th century. It was magnificent to look at, but without modern heating, those stone walls were nothing more than an icebox. By early afternoon, the temperature inside had dropped to 45 degrees. They gathered in the library, the only room with a working fireplace. They were wrapped in designer coats and cashmere blankets, shivering as the damp cold seeped into their bones. But there was a problem. I had the only key to the woodshed, and I had taken it with me. There was no firewood. Richard looked around the room, desperate for warmth. His eyes landed on the mahogany bookshelves that lined the walls. These shelves held my grandfather's collection, first editions of Dickens, leather-bound history volumes from the 1800s, books that I had spent years cataloging and preserving. To me, they were sacred artifacts of our family history. To Richard, they were just dry paper. He stood up and grabbed a stack of vintage encyclopedias. He did not hesitate. He threw them into the hearth and struck a match. I was not there to see it, but the thought of those pages curling and blackening in the flames made me physically ill. He was burning knowledge to warm his own arrogance. He was destroying the very legacy he claimed to protect, just to avoid admitting defeat. As night fell, the mansion sat on the hill, completely dark, a black void against the skyline. Inside, the former king of the castle sat on the floor feeding history into a fire while his breath formed clouds in the freezing air. He thought he was surviving. He did not realize that with every book he burned, he was proving exactly why he never deserved to inherit them in the first place. Hunger and cold have a way of clarifying things. By 3 in the morning, the temperature in the mansion had dropped to 38 degrees. Richard could see his breath in the beam of the flashlight as he shook Preston awake. The plan was born not out of strategy, but out of pure survival instinct. If they were going to be kicked out, they were not going to leave empty-handed. They were going to take the golden parachutes that had been hanging on the walls for decades. They moved through the darkened hallways like ghosts in their own home. Richard led the way, holding a heavy brass candlestick not for light, but as a potential weapon. Preston followed, shivering in his designer coat, his eyes darting around nervously. They were not heading for the safe or the jewelry box. They were heading for the West Gallery. "This is not stealing," Richard whispered, his voice rasping in the cold air. "This is reclaiming assets. My father bought these paintings. They belong to the bloodline. Ethan thinks he can lock the accounts, but he cannot lock up physical objects. We sell these, and we disappear. We start over in Europe." They stopped in front of 3 specific canvases. Richard had chosen them carefully: a small Rembrandt etching, a Turner landscape, and a moody seascape by Winslow Homer. Collectively, they were worth $4 million, enough to buy a new life, enough to make the shame go away. "Lift it," Richard commanded, pointing the flashlight at the Homer. "Careful with the frame." Preston hesitated. "Dad, this is a felony. If we get caught with these across state lines, it is federal trafficking." "Do you want to freeze to death?" Richard hissed, grabbing Preston by the lapel. "Do you want to end up working at a gas station while your brother laughs at us from his high horse? Take the painting down, Preston. Now." Preston swallowed hard and reached up. The heavy gilded frame came away from the wall, leaving a rectangular ghost mark on the velvet wallpaper. They worked in silence, wrapping the masterpieces in blankets stripped from the guest beds. It was a pathetic sight. The patriarch of the family and his favorite son, scurrying through the shadows like common burglars, looting their own heritage. They carried the bundles out the side door, avoiding the squeaky floorboards they had known since childhood. The cold night air hit them like a slap, but the adrenaline kept them warm. They loaded the paintings into the trunk of Preston's Porsche. As the trunk latch clicked shut, Richard let out a breath he did not know he was holding. He felt a surge of triumph. He thought he had outsmarted me one last time. He thought he was driving away with millions. He had no idea that he was actually driving straight into a trap I had set 10 years ago. They started the engine and sped down the driveway, leaving the dark, silent mansion behind them. They were driving fast, but they were not driving toward freedom. They were driving toward the final humiliation. The meeting took place in the back room of a discreet gallery in Providence. The buyer was a man named Markov, who did not ask questions about provenance or ownership. He only cared about authenticity. Richard stood under the harsh fluorescent light, watching Markov examine the Winslow Homer painting with a jeweler's loupe. Preston paced by the metal door, nervously checking his watch every 30 seconds, terrified that the police were already outside. Richard was already spending the money in his head. $4 million. He would buy a villa in Tuscany. He would leave Nia and her loud mouth behind. He would show everyone that Richard Sterling always lands on his feet. "Well," Richard asked impatiently, "it is a masterpiece, isn't it? My father bought it in London in 1960. The brushwork is undeniable. Just give us the cash so we can conclude this business." Markov stood up slowly and took the loupe out of his eye. He looked at Richard with a cold, unamused expression. He did not reach for his checkbook. He reached for a bottle of turpentine and a rag. Before Richard could scream, Markov rubbed the corner of the painting vigorously. "What are you doing?" Richard shrieked, lunging forward. "You are destroying a national treasure. You are insane." Markov held up the rag. It was stained with blue pigment. Then he pointed to the canvas. Where there should have been century-old oil paint hard as stone, there was now a smear of fresh, modern acrylic. "It is a fake," Markov said, his voice deadly quiet. "And not even an old fake. This paint is less than 5 years old. It is a copy. A very good copy, but it is worthless. Richard froze. That is impossible, he stammered. It has hung on that wall for 50 years. I grew up looking at it. Markov moved to the Turner and the Rembrandt. He did not even need the chemical test. He shone a UV light on the bottom corner of the Rembrandt. Under the ultraviolet glow, a hidden inscription appeared in clear fluorescent lettering. Replica painted by Ethan Sterling. Archival purposes only. 2018. Richard stared at the glowing letters. The room seemed to spin. The realization hit him like a physical blow. I had not just locked the bank accounts. I had anticipated his greed years ago. I knew that one day he would try to sell the family heritage to cover his debts. So I had used my skills as a master restorer to create perfect replicas. I had swapped the originals and moved them to a climate-controlled vault in Boston long before he ever thought to steal them. Preston fell to his knees, grasping his hair. "We stole fakes," he whispered. "We committed a felony for posters. We are going to jail for nothing." Markov was not laughing. He was a dangerous man who did not like having his time wasted with forgeries. He signaled to his 2 large bodyguards who stepped out of the shadows, blocking the exit. "You come into my house with this garbage," Markov growled. "You insult my intelligence. Now you are going to sit right there while I make a phone call. And you better pray the person on the other end is in a forgiving mood, because I am certainly not." The phone call I received at 3:15 in the morning was not from the police. It was from Sergei Markov. Most people in Newport knew Markov as an eccentric art collector. I knew him as the man you went to when you wanted to move inventory without questions. He had my private number because I had restored a scorched Vermeer for him 2 years ago, a job that required discretion and absolute silence. When I saw his name on the caller ID, I knew exactly what had happened. He did not sound angry. He sounded amused. "Ethan, my friend," he rumbled, his voice thick with a Russian accent. "I have 2 men here in my back room. They claim to be Sterlings. They are trying to sell me those replicas you painted for your thesis. Should I call the authorities, or would you like to come collect your garbage?" I drove to the gallery in silence. The city was asleep, but my mind was wide open. When I arrived, I did not park in the alley like a thief. I parked my truck right in front of the main entrance under the streetlights. I walked to the heavy steel door and buzzed once. It opened immediately. The scene inside was a tableau of pathetic defeat. Richard and Preston were sitting on metal folding chairs, their hands shaking, their faces pale and sweating. Behind them stood 2 of Markov's enforcers, arms crossed, looking bored. When Richard saw me walk in, he did not look relieved. He looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He had spent his entire life telling me I was useless, telling me I had no street smarts. Yet here I was, walking into a den of wolves that had him trembling, and the alpha wolf was standing up to shake my hand. "I am sorry about this, Sergei," I said, ignoring my father completely. "My relatives are having a difficult week. They are confused." Markov laughed, slapping me on the shoulder. "Confused is one word for it. They asked for $4 million for acrylic on canvas. I almost admired the audacity. I pulled out my checkbook and wrote a check for $5,000. "For your time and the disturbance," I said, handing it to him. Markov looked at the check, then at Richard. "You are lucky your son has talent, old man. If he was anyone else, you would be leaving here in a trunk, not a passenger seat." He waved his hand, dismissing us like we were boring guests. "Get them out of here, Ethan. They smell like fear." I turned to my father and brother. "Up," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cracked like a whip in the quiet room. "Get up, now." They stood up slowly, their legs unsteady. I turned and walked out the front door, my head high. I did not check to see if they were following. I knew they were. They shuffled behind me, heads bowed, keeping their eyes on the pavement like disciplined prisoners. Richard tried to say something as we reached the truck, something about how he did not know. "Get in." I interrupted him, unlocking the doors. "You do not get to speak. You just tried to sell my work to a criminal and you failed even at being a thief. Tonight proved one thing, Dad. You are not a businessman. You are not a patriarch. You are just an amateur, and amateurs get people killed." While Richard and Preston sat in the kitchen staring at the floor in a stupor of defeat, Nia was upstairs making a cold calculation. She had watched from the landing as they walked in, empty-handed. She saw the fear in Preston's eyes and the slump of Richard's shoulders. She did not need to ask what happened. She knew. The art heist had failed, the money was gone, and the Sterling dynasty was officially dead. Nia did not cry. She did not rush down to comfort her husband. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked quietly into Richard's master bedroom. The room was freezing cold, but Nia was sweating with adrenaline. She knew that if the ship was sinking, she needed to be on the only lifeboat. And in her world, a lifeboat was made of gold and diamonds. She moved to the large walk-in closet, pushing aside Richard's rows of bespoke Italian suits. Hidden behind a false panel was the wall safe. Richard thought he was secretive, but he was actually predictable. Nia had watched him punch in the code 6 months ago. She remembered it perfectly. It was his own birthday. Typical narcissist. She typed in the numbers. Beep, 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 click. The heavy door swung open. Inside there was no cash Richard had spent at all. But there was something else. Several velvet boxes stacked in the corner. These contained the jewelry of Beatrice Sterling, my late mother. Richard had refused to give them to me or to charity, claiming he was saving them for a future granddaughter. The truth was, he treated them as a rainy day fund. Nia grabbed the boxes and dumped the contents onto the cold floor. A diamond tennis bracelet, a sapphire choker, a pair of 3-carat emerald earrings. Even in the dim light of her flashlight, they sparkled with a promise of freedom. This was easily $200,000 worth of gems. She did not feel guilty. In her twisted mind, she felt entitled to this. She told herself that this was her severance package. She had wasted 5 years of her youth on Preston, listening to his stupid business ideas and tolerating his arrogant father. She deserved payment for her time. She deserved compensation for the embarrassment of being evicted. She swept the jewelry into her designer handbag, wrapping the delicate pieces in a silk scarf she pulled from the rack. She moved quickly, checking the hallway to make sure the men were still downstairs, wallowing in their misery. She was not going to tell Preston she was leaving. She was not going to leave a note. She planned to slip out the back door, call an Uber to the train station, and disappear into the city before the sun came up. She zipped the bag shut and caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked haggard but determined. "I am a survivor," she whispered to herself. "I am not going down with these losers." She adjusted her coat, grabbed her car keys just in case, and stepped out into the hallway. She thought she was making a clean getaway. She did not know that I was already parked at the bottom of the driveway, waiting for the final rat to desert the ship. Nia sped down the winding driveway, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She could see the main gate approaching. It was the threshold between her failed past and her stolen future. But just as she prepared to turn onto the main road, a pair of blinding high beams flared to life directly in her path. She slammed on the brakes, her tires screeching on the asphalt, as her car skidded to a halt just inches from the heavy steel bumper of my Ford truck. She pounded the horn, screaming obscenities, expecting me to move. When I did not budge, she threw her door open and stormed out into the cold night air. Her coat flapped in the wind, and she clutched her handbag tightly to her chest, the bag that contained $250,000 of my mother's jewelry. "Move your truck, Ethan," she shrieked, her voice hysteria rising. "I am leaving. You won. Is that not what you wanted? Get out of my way, or I will call the police and tell them you are holding me hostage." I stepped out of my truck, slowly holding a thick manila envelope. I did not raise my voice. I leaned against my hood and looked at her with the exhaustion of a man who was tired of cleaning up messes. "You can call the police, Nia," I said, calm and steady. "In fact, I think they would be very interested in the contents of your purse. Grand larceny is a serious charge, especially when you steal from an estate in probate." Nia clutched the bag tighter, stepping back. "These are gifts," she lied. "Your father gave them to me." I ignored the lie and held up the envelope. "But the theft is the least of your problems. This is a forensic audit of your influencer business. We pulled the records during the discovery phase of the defamation suit. It turns out you have a very creative relationship with the Internal Revenue Service." Nia froze. The color drained from her face even under the heavy makeup. I continued flipping through the pages. You claimed your entire wardrobe as a business expense. You wrote off the family vacations to Cabo and Aspen as market research. And most interestingly, you have reported zero taxable income for 5 years while posting about your six-figure lifestyle. That is tax fraud, Nia. Federal tax fraud. I took a step closer, tossing the envelope onto the hood of her car. I have already drafted the tip to the IRS. All I have to do is hit send. If I do that, you will not just be broke. You will be in a federal prison cell wearing an orange jumpsuit that definitely does not fit your aesthetic. Nia looked at the envelope, then at me. Her arrogance crumbled, leaving only fear. What do you want? She whispered. I pointed to the handbag. Leave the jewelry, leave the car which the trust pays for, and leave this state. If I ever see you in Newport again, if you ever post one more word about this family, I send the file. She did not hesitate. The survival instinct that had driven her to steal now drove her to surrender. She threw the handbag onto the ground at my feet. She looked at the car, then at the long, dark road leading to the train station. Without a word, she turned and began walking into the night, her high heels clicking unevenly on the pavement. She was leaving with nothing but the clothes on her back, just as she had arrived. I picked up the bag and watched her disappear into the darkness. The queen of social media had been demonetized permanently. The sound of Nia's car fading into the distance was the death knell of Preston's marriage. He stood in the driveway for a long time, waiting for her to come back, waiting for it to be a prank. But the cold wind finally forced him inside. He walked into the kitchen, searching for a note, searching for anything that would make sense of the madness. He found it on the marble island. It was not a handwritten letter of apology. It was a thick envelope from a law firm. Nia had been planning this for weeks. She had the divorce papers ready, just waiting for the moment the money ran out. Preston opened the document. The words stared back at him, black and stark. Irreconcilable differences, demand for spousal support. She was not just leaving him, she was suing him for a lifestyle he could no longer afford. Preston sank onto the floor, his back against the refrigerator. He let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He was 36 years old, he had no job, he had no home, and now he had no wife. The golden child had been stripped of all his gold. Richard walked into the room. He looked older than his years, his face gray and drawn. He saw Preston on the floor and the papers scattered around him. He did not offer comfort. He did not hug his son. Instead, he felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. His family was dissolving before his eyes. "Stand up!" Richard barked, his voice shaking. "Stop crying. We are Sterlings. We do not quit. We will fight this. We will counter-sue." Preston looked up, his eyes hollow. "It is over, Dad. She is gone. The money is gone. Ethan won." "Don't you say that name," Richard screamed. He raised his fist to strike the counter to assert his dominance one last time. But the blow never landed. As his arm went up, his face twisted. A sudden sharp pain exploded behind his eyes like a flashbang grenade. His vision blurred and the left side of his body went numb. He tried to speak, but only a garbled slur came out. The room tilted violently. Richard Sterling, the man who had commanded rooms and terrified subordinates, crumpled to the linoleum floor like a marionette with cut strings. Dad Preston scrambled over to him. "Dad, wake up!" Richard's eyes were open, but they were filled with terror. He was conscious, but he was trapped in a body that no longer obeyed him. The stress of the eviction, the cold of the unheated house, and the shock of the final betrayal had pushed his blood pressure past the breaking point. This was not a performance. This was not a fake heart attack on the porch to garner sympathy. This was a massive stroke. Preston fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling so hard he dropped it twice. He dialed 911, screaming into the receiver. "My father. He is not breathing right. Send help. Please send help." For the first time in his life, Preston was truly alone. He held his father's cold hand, listening to the distant siren drawing closer. The dynasty had not just fallen, It had crashed and burned, leaving nothing but wreckage on the kitchen floor. I arrived at Newport Hospital 20 minutes after the ambulance. Preston was sitting in the waiting room, looking like a ghost in his expensive coat. He did not have health insurance. He did not have a credit card that worked. I had to put my own card down just to get my father admitted into a private room. Even in their complete downfall, they were still costing me money. The doctors told me it was a minor stroke brought on by extreme hypertension and stress. He would recover physically, but his mind was apparently stuck in a loop of bitterness. I walked into his room expecting some level of humility. I thought that facing death might have given him some perspective. I thought maybe, just maybe, he would be grateful that I was there. I was wrong. Richard was propped up in bed, hooked to monitors, his face sagging slightly on the left side. When he saw me standing in the doorway, his heart rate monitor spiked, not with joy, but with anger. "You!" he rasped, his voice slurred but dripping with venom. "You put me here." I stepped closer, checking the IV drip, ensuring he was comfortable. "I did not put you here, Dad. Your choices did. I paid for the room. I made sure you have the best neurologist in the state." He tried to sit up but fell back against the pillows, weak and shaking. "Do not play the saint with me. You are a thief. You tricked me. Those paintings, you swapped them. That is fraud, Ethan. That is art fraud." I looked at him in disbelief. "You stole them, Dad. You and Preston broke into the house and stole them to sell on the black market. I protected the assets of the trust. That is not fraud. That is stewardship." Richard's face turned red again, the machine beeping a warning rhythm. "I will sue you. As soon as I get out of this bed, I am calling the police. I will tell them you forged masters. I will tell them you gaslighted me. You will rot in jail for this." I stood there listening to a man who had nothing left but his rage. He was alive because I paid for his care. He had a roof over his head right now because I signed the admission forms. And yet his only thought was how to destroy me. I realized then that there was no bottom to his narcissism. There was no rock bottom where he would look up and say he was sorry. He would rather die hating me than live being grateful to me. I placed the nurse call button on his bedside table. "Do what you have to do, Dad," I said softly. "But remember one thing. The police already saw the security footage of you loading those frames into the Porsche. If you call them, you are just turning yourself in." I turned to leave. "Where are you going?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "You cannot leave me here. Who is going to pay the bill?" I stopped at the door. "The trust covers medical emergencies for life tenants," I said. "Even evicted ones. You are safe, Dad. But you are alone." I walked out into the corridor, leaving him shouting at the empty room. His voice faded as the heavy door closed, sealing him in with his own poison. I felt a strange lightness in my chest. The guilt was finally gone. I had done my duty. I had shown compassion. And having it thrown back in my face was the final closure I needed. I was free. 2 weeks after his stroke, Richard Sterling dragged himself into the conference room of a neutral law firm for court-ordered mediation. He looked like a shadow of his former self. His left arm was still stiff, and he walked with a noticeable limp, using a cane that he wielded more like a weapon than a support. But his eyes were still burning with the same arrogant fire. He had not come to make peace. He had come to demand a surrender. Sitting next to him was his legal representation. In the past, Richard would have hired the most expensive shark in Boston. Today, he was represented by a man named Mr. Crandall, who wore an ill-fitting polyester suit that shone under the fluorescent lights. Crandall smelled of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. He was the kind of lawyer you hired from a billboard on the side of the highway when you had no money and a weak case. It was a pathetic visual representation of how far the mighty had fallen. On our side of the table, the atmosphere was different. Henderson sat with the stillness of a predator. His bespoke wool suit cost more than Crandall's car. I sat beside him looking at my father. I did not feel hate anymore. I just felt a profound exhaustion. I wanted this to be over. Crandall cleared his throat, shuffling a stack of disorganized papers. "We are here to contest the eviction. He began, his voice wavering slightly under Henderson's gaze. My client, Mr. Sterling, contends that he was under duress when he signed the original trust documents 10 years ago. Furthermore, he claims that his son Ethan manipulated the terms of the life estate through psychological pressure and elder abuse. We are demanding the immediate reinstatement of Richard Sterling to the property and punitive damages of $5 million. Richard nodded aggressively, banging his cane on the floor for emphasis. Tell them about the fraud, Crandall. Tell them how he stole my paintings. Crandall looked nervous. Yes. We also allege that the current trustee misappropriated art assets belonging to the estate. Henderson did not even open his file. He simply took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly with a silk cloth. Is that all? He asked quietly. Because if that is your opening statement, Mr. Crandall, you might want to check your malpractice insurance. Richard slammed his good hand on the table. Do not talk to him like that. I am Richard Sterling. I built this family. That house is mine. I want it back. I looked at my father. He really believed it. He had rewritten history in his head so many times that he actually believed he was the victim. He ignored the gambling debts. He ignored the years of insults. He ignored the fact that he tried to sell fake art to a Russian mobster. In his mind, he was just a poor old man being bullied by an ungrateful son. Mr. Sterling, Henderson said, putting his glasses back on. We are not here to debate your feelings. We are here to look at facts. And the fact is, you hired a strip mall lawyer to argue a case that you lost the moment you decided to treat your son like a servant instead of a beneficiary. We are not going to settle. We are not going to pay you a dime. In fact, we are about to show you why you should have stayed in your subsidized apartment instead of coming here to embarrass yourself further. Henderson signaled to his assistant, who dimmed the lights. I watched Preston shift uncomfortably in his chair in the corner. He knew what was coming. Richard, however, sat with his chin raised, defiant to the end. He had no idea that the screen descending from the ceiling was about to play the final credits of his delusions. Mr. Crandall opened a thick manila folder and pulled out a stack of affidavits. He placed them on the table with a triumphant slap. We have statements here from 12 family members who attended the anniversary party, Crandall announced. They all testify to the same pattern of behavior. Ethan Sterling has been isolating his father for years, controlling his finances and verbally abusing him to induce a state of dependency. I watched as he handed the papers to Henderson. I recognized the names at the bottom of the pages. Uncle Bob, who owed me money. Cousin Sarah, who had asked me for a loan just last month and was refused. They had all lined up behind Richard, not because they believed him, but because they hoped that if he won back the house, the free ride would restart. Richard leaned forward, playing his role to perfection. He wiped a non-existent tear from his eye. I was terrified of him, Richard whispered, his voice trembling. He would lock me in my room. He would tell me that I was senile. He threatened to burn the house down if I did not sign over the deed. I only agreed to his terms because I wanted to protect my wife's legacy. Preston nodded vigorously from his corner. It is true. I saw it. Ethan is a monster behind closed doors. He hates us because we are successful. He wanted to destroy us. The mediator, a retired judge, looked concerned. He turned to Henderson. These are serious accusations, Mr. Henderson. If there is evidence of elder abuse, this moves from a civil property dispute to a criminal matter. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. They were not just trying to get the house back. They were trying to put me in prison. They were willing to destroy my entire life with perjury just to save their own pride. I looked at my father, and for the first time I saw him clearly. He was not just a narcissist. He was a sociopath. He did not care who he hurt, as long as he won. Henderson read through the affidavit slowly. He did not look worried. In fact, he looked like a man who had just been dealt a royal flush. He closed the folder and looked at Crandall. So, to clarify, Henderson said, his voice level. Your official stance is that Ethan Sterling was the aggressor. You are claiming that Richard was a helpless victim who was coerced and threatened. And you have 12 witnesses who are willing to swear to this under oath. Absolutely, Crandall said, puffing out his chest. We will take this to a jury if we have to. Henderson smiled. It was the first time I had seen him smile all day. It was not a nice smile. That will not be necessary, Mr. Crandall. You see, the problem with lying about what happens in a house is that houses have eyes, and the Sterling estate has very good eyes. Henderson reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silver USB drive I had retrieved from the guest house. He placed it on the table. It made a small metallic click that sounded like the cocking of a gun. We took the liberty of compiling a different kind of testimony, Henderson said. We call it the unedited truth. Would you like to watch a movie, Richard? Henderson stood up and walked to the media console at the head of the table. He did not hurry. Every movement was calculated to let the dread build in the room. He took the silver USB drive and inserted it into the laptop connected to the main projector. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh blue glow over Richard's pale face. Mr. Crandall Henderson, said his voice cutting through the hum of the cooling fan. You just submitted sworn statements claiming your client was a victim of terror. You claimed he was frail, confused, and manipulated. Let us see if the camera agrees. He pressed the spacebar. The video that appeared on the wall was not grainy amateur footage. It was high-definition 4K video with crystal-clear audio taken from the main security camera in the estate's foyer. The timestamp in the corner read 11:42 p.m. on the night of the anniversary party. On screen, Richard Sterling was not frail. He was standing in the center of the hallway, red-faced and swaying with a glass of scotch in his hand. He was screaming at me. The volume was so loud that the mediator actually flinched. I own you. Richard's digital voice boomed, echoing off the law firm's walls. You are nothing without me, Ethan. I spent your inheritance because I deserved it. I am the king of this house, and you are just the janitor. In the video, I stood perfectly still, my hands behind my back, taking the abuse without a word. Richard then threw his glass. It shattered against the wall inches from my head. He lunged forward, grabbing me by the lapels and shaking me violently. Sign the check, or I will burn this house to the ground with you inside it, Richard screamed on the recording. Henderson paused the video on a close-up of Richard's face, twisted in pure unadulterated malice. He looked at Crandall, who was now sweating profusely and loosening his cheap tie. That does not look like a terrified elderly victim, Mr. Crandall Henderson noted dryly. That looks like assault. That looks like a threat of arson. And most importantly, that is a direct confession to misappropriating the inheritance funds. Richard stared at the frozen image of himself. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He looked at the mediator, hoping for some kind of procedural objection, but the judge's face had turned to stone. Henderson hit play again. The video jumped to another clip from a month prior. It showed Richard and Preston laughing in the study. Who cares about the trust, Preston said in the video. Just sell the silver collection. Ethan won't notice. He is too stupid to notice. Richard replied, laughing as he lit a cigar. We will bleed the account dry and then kick him out when the money is gone. The room went dead silent. The evidence was not just damaging, it was catastrophic. The affidavits from the family members, which described Richard as a saint, were instantly exposed as perjury. The narrative of the poor, victimized father evaporated, leaving only the ugly truth of a conspirator caught on tape. Henderson stopped the playback and pulled the USB drive out. He tossed it onto the mahogany table where it slid across and hit Richard's hand. That is Exhibit A, Henderson said. We have 300 hours more just like it. Would you like to see the one where you discuss hiding assets from the IRS, or have we seen enough? Crandall closed his folder slowly. He did not look at Richard. He looked at the mediator. I think we need a recess, he whispered. There will be no recess, the mediator said, his voice shaking with anger. I have seen enough. Mr. Sterling, you have wasted the court's time and you have insulted my intelligence. The room was already silent, but Henderson was not finished. He looked at the mediator, whose face had gone pale, and then he looked at me. There was a flicker of genuine sympathy in his eyes before he turned back to the screen. He hovered the mouse cursor over a file simply labeled Barnaby. I felt a chill run down my spine. Barnaby was my golden retriever. He had died suddenly last year after a week of agonizing seizures. The vet had been baffled, calling it an idiopathic neurological collapse. I had mourned him for months. Henderson clicked the file. The timestamp was dated 3 days before Barnaby died. The video showed the library again. Richard was sitting in his leather armchair nursing a brandy while Preston paced the floor looking agitated. "He is not cracking," Preston complained on the recording. I tried to pressure him about the custodial duties, but he just quotes the rulebook. He is too focused. We need him distracted. We need him too depressed to manage the accounts. Richard took a slow sip of his drink. "Every man has a weakness, Preston. Ethan does not care about women. He does not care about cars. He cares about that mangy dog. It is the only thing that loves him." I stared at the screen, my hands gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. Preston stopped pacing. "The dog," he asked. "What does that get us?" Richard smiled, a cruel, thin smile that made my stomach turn. "Grief is a powerful tool. If the dog were to suddenly get sick, say from eating something he shouldn't, like some dark chocolate or perhaps a little antifreeze, Ethan would be a wreck. He would spend weeks at the vet. He would stop checking the ledgers, and while he is crying over a dead animal, we transfer the funds." Preston hesitated for a second, then laughed. "You are diabolical, Dad. Do we have any antifreeze in the garage?" "I will have the gardener leave a bottle out," Richard said casually. "Just make sure it looks like an accident. We need him broken, not suspicious." The video ended. The screen went black, but the sound of their laughter seemed to hang in the air. I could not breathe. I was back in the vet's office holding Barnaby's paw while he convulsed. I remembered Richard comforting me, telling me it was just nature taking its course. I remembered Preston offering to drive me to the crematorium. They had murdered my best friend. They had watched me cry and used my grief as a smokescreen to try and embezzle money. The silence in the conference room was absolute. It was the silence of people who had just witnessed something truly monstrous. Mr. Crandall, the cheap lawyer, slowly closed his file. He looked at Richard with open disgust. He stood up and began packing his briefcase. "What are you doing?" Richard stammered, looking around wildly. "Defend me." That was out of context. It was a joke. We never did it. The dog just died. Crandall did not look at him. "I am withdrawing as counsel," he said, his voice flat. "I represent thieves and liars, Mr. Sterling, but I do not represent psychopaths. You are on your own." The mediator slammed his hand on the table. "This mediation is terminated. Mr. Henderson, please forward that footage to the district attorney. This is no longer a civil dispute. This is conspiracy to commit animal cruelty and criminal fraud. Get out of my office." Richard sat frozen in his chair. For the first time, he looked small. He looked at me, pleading with his eyes, begging for the son he had tormented to save him one last time. But the son who had loved him was gone, buried along with the dog he had killed. I stood up and walked out of the room without a backward glance, leaving him to the wolves he had created. The video screen went black, but the image of Richard plotting the death of a helpless animal seemed to be burned into the retinas of everyone in the room. In American culture, there is an unspoken hierarchy of sin. You can embezzle money and people might call you greedy. You can cheat on your taxes and people might call you clever. But the moment you harm a family pet, especially a golden retriever, you cross a line from being a criminal to being a monster. It is the one act that society refuses to forgive. The 12 family members who had filed into the back of the room to support Richard sat in a stunned, frozen silence. These were people who had justified Richard's gambling. They had looked the other way when he insulted me. They were willing to lie under oath to get a piece of the inheritance. But this was different. This was visceral. Richard looked around the room, his eyes darting from face to face, desperate for an ally. He tried to laugh, a nervous, jarring sound that echoed in the quiet room. "Oh, come on," Richard said, spreading his hands wide. "It was just a dog. A stupid animal. We did what we had to do to save the estate. Do not look at me like that. We are family." Uncle Bob, the man who had sworn in his affidavit that I was an abuser, stood up slowly. He looked at Richard not with the deference he usually showed, but with a look of pure revulsion. Bob had a black Labrador at home. He reached into his pocket, took out the affidavit he had signed, and ripped it in half. "I am out," Bob said, his voice low and angry. I am withdrawing my testimony. I thought this was about money, Richard. I did not know you were sick. Cousin Sarah, who had been hoping for a loan, grabbed her purse and stood up next to him. She backed away from Richard as if he were contagious. You killed Barnaby, she whispered. He was the sweetest dog in the world. You let Ethan cry on your shoulder while you poisoned him. You are not a victim. You are a sociopath. Richard's face turned purple. Sit down, he commanded, trying to summon the authority he had lost. I am the head of this family. You will do as I say. No one sat down. One by one, the witnesses turned their backs. The murmurs of support turned into whispers of disgust. They realized that defending Richard now would taint them forever. They did not want to be known as the people who stood by the dog killer. They shuffled toward the exit, leaving a wide berth around Richard's chair. Even Preston, who was usually his father's shadow, looked down at his shoes, unable to meet the gaze of the room. He had been an accomplice, but seeing it played back on a 60-inch screen stripped away the glamour of their conspiracy. It just looked cruel and pathetic. The mediator watched the exodus with a grim satisfaction. He turned to the stenographer. Let the record show that all witnesses for the plaintiff have voluntarily withdrawn their support. Mr. Sterling, you are now standing alone in a room full of people who know exactly what you are. The silence in the conference room was heavy and absolute. The mediator sat back in his chair, his face hard. He was no longer looking at Richard as a disputing party in a civil case. He was looking at him as a criminal defendant who had walked into the wrong room. The mediator adjusted his glasses and spoke with a terrifying calmness. Mr. Sterling, let us be very clear about where we stand. This mediation is over. The video evidence we just viewed establishes probable cause for aggravated animal cruelty and conspiracy to commit fraud. In Rhode Island, those are felonies that carry significant prison time. Given your confession on tape, I would estimate a minimum sentence of 3 to 5 years, and that is before the IRS gets involved. Richard slumped in his chair. The word prison hung in the air like a guillotine blade. He was an old man with high blood pressure and soft hands. He would not survive a week in a state penitentiary. He looked at the door, but there was no exit. He looked at Preston, but his son was staring at the floor, defeated. Henderson slid a single document across the polished mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of Richard. This is a quitclaim deed coupled with a settlement agreement, Henderson said, his voice devoid of emotion. It states that you voluntarily relinquish all claims to the Sterling estate. You waive your life estate. You waive any right to spousal support from the trust. And you agree to a permanent restraining order never to contact Ethan or set foot on the property again. Richard looked at the paper. It was an unconditional surrender. It was the legal equivalent of suicide. If I sign this, he whispered, his voice trembling, I have nothing. I will be homeless. Henderson leaned forward. If you sign it, we agree not to forward the USB drive to the district attorney today. You walk out of here with your freedom. If you do not sign it, the mediator is obligated by law to report the crime he just witnessed. You will leave this building in handcuffs. Richard looked at me one last time. He was searching for the boy who used to seek his approval. He was looking for the son who would never let his father go to jail. But that son was gone. I sat perfectly still, my hand resting near the USB drive. I was thinking of Barnaby. I was thinking of the years of psychological torture. I did not blink. Richard picked up the pen. His hand shook so violently that the tip tapped against the paper, creating a staccato rhythm of fear. He realized he had no leverage. He had no power. He was just a sad old man, caught in his own trap. He pressed the pen to the paper. With a jagged, ugly scrawl, he signed his name. Henderson snatched the document away the moment the pen lifted. He checked the signature and nodded to the mediator. It is done. The mediator stood up. Then get out of my office, Mr. Sterling. You are lucky these men are more merciful than you were to that dog. Go. Richard stood up, using the table for support. He did not look back. He grabbed his cane and shuffled toward the door. A king without a kingdom, a father without a son. He walked out into the hallway and the heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing his fate forever. 6 months is a long time in the world of the wealthy, but it is an eternity in the world of the poor. The winter in Newport had turned brutal with icy winds whipping off the Atlantic, but the cold was no longer Ethan's problem. The chill had followed the evicted members of the Sterling family settling into their bones and their new realities. The dispersal of the toxic trio was complete and absolute. Nia Sterling was the first to vanish. She did not stick around to help her husband navigate bankruptcy court. She did not visit her father-in-law in the hospital. 2 days after the confrontation in the driveway, her social media accounts went dark. There was no farewell post, no tearful explanation, just a sudden digital silence that spoke volumes. The rumors in Newport were that she had moved to Miami, legally changing her name back to her maiden name. Some said she was working as a hostess in a nightclub, trying to snag a new wealthy target before her looks faded. Others said she was living in a studio apartment selling knockoff handbags online. The truth was irrelevant. Nia was a parasite who had been forcibly detached from her host. Without the Sterling name, she was simply a ghost, fading into the background of a world that no longer cared about her opinion on fashion. She had traded her dignity for a quick exit, and now she was nobody. For Preston, the fall was far more public and far more humiliating. The man who had once driven a Porsche strictly for leisure now found himself standing behind a register at a discount supermarket on the outskirts of Providence. His Italian suits were gone, sold to a consignment shop for pennies on the dollar. In their place, he wore a stiff green polyester vest that smelled faintly of onions and industrial cleaner. His name tag hung crookedly on his chest, a small plastic badge that stripped away his identity as a Sterling and reduced him to just another employee number. The rhythm of his life was no longer defined by tea times and cocktail hours. It was defined by the relentless beep of the optical scanner. Beep, a can of beans. Beep, a loaf of white bread. Beep, a pack of generic diapers. He stood there for 8 hours a day, his feet aching in cheap shoes, forcing a smile for customers who looked through him as if he were part of the machinery. The worst moment came on a Tuesday afternoon. A woman walked into his lane pushing a cart overflowing with organic produce and expensive wine. Preston recognized her immediately. It was Mrs. Vanderbilt, a woman who had attended the anniversary party just months ago. She had been one of the guests who laughed at Richard's jokes and sneered at Ethan. Preston froze. He tried to turn away, pretending to organize the candy bars, but there was nowhere to hide. Mrs. Vanderbilt looked at him. She looked at the green vest. She looked at his tired eyes. For a second, Preston hoped for a spark of recognition, perhaps a word of sympathy. Instead, she simply placed a divider on the conveyor belt and looked at her phone. She knew exactly who he was. She just did not care. To her and to the rest of their former circle, Preston had ceased to exist the moment the money ran out. He was not a person falling on hard times. He was a cautionary tale. He finished scanning her items in silence, his face burning with shame. As she walked away without a thank you, Preston realized that Ethan had not just evicted them from a house. He had evicted them from society. He went back to scanning, feeling the weight of every mistake pressing down on his shoulders. He was 36 years old, and for the first time in his life he was earning a living. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. But if Preston was in purgatory, Richard was in hell. The state social services had placed him in a subsidized housing complex on the far side of the city. It was a brutal concrete block of a building located next to a noisy highway overpass. The walls were paper thin, allowing the sounds of his neighbors' arguments and crying babies to bleed into his space at all hours. His apartment was a single room, a studio that was smaller than the walk-in closet he used to have in the master bedroom. There was no mahogany here. There were no oil paintings. The furniture was particle board that chipped if you looked at it wrong. The carpet was a stained industrial brown. Richard sat in a recliner he had salvaged from a thrift store, staring at a small television that only picked up 6 channels. His stroke had left him with a permanent limp and a trembling left hand, which made simple tasks like opening a can of soup a frustrating ordeal. He spent his days in a state of bewildered rage. He would sit by the window watching the gray slush pile up on the sidewalk, waiting for the phone to ring. He still believed in some dark corner of his mind that this was a mistake. He told himself that the lawyers would find a loophole. He told himself that Ethan would come to his senses and beg for forgiveness. He checked his mailbox every single day, shuffling down the hallway with his cane. Every day it was empty except for flyers for hearing aids and debt consolidation services. The isolation was absolute. The friends he had bought with expensive dinners never visited. The business associates he had bragged to never called. He was an old man in a room that smelled of boiled cabbage and regret. One evening, while flipping through the channels, the news came on. A local reporter was standing in front of the Newport Art Museum. Richard leaned forward, his heart skipping a beat. The reporter was talking about a new exhibition of rare maritime art. And there on the screen, standing next to the museum director, was Ethan. Ethan looked different. He was wearing a tailored suit that fit perfectly. He looked healthy, calm, and confident. He was smiling as he shook hands with the mayor. The banner behind him read, "The Sterling Collection, restored and presented by Ethan Sterling." Richard stared at the screen, his mouth open. Ethan had not just saved the art. He had shared it. He was being celebrated as a philanthropist and a guardian of history. The reporter called him a man of integrity. Richard looked around his dingy apartment. He looked at the peeling paint and the flickering light bulb. He realized then that the narrative had been rewritten without him. He was not the hero who was wronged. He was the villain who had been defeated. He tried to scream at the television, to shout his usual insults, but the words died in his throat. He felt a sudden crushing weight in his chest. It was not another heart attack. It was the realization that he was irrelevant. He had spent his life trying to build a monument to himself, and all he had achieved was a lonely room in a concrete box. He turned off the TV, plunging the room into darkness. He sat there in the silence, listening to the traffic on the highway, the sound of a world moving on, leaving him behind in the cold. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he thought of Barnaby the dog. He remembered the look in the dog's eyes. And in the dark, Richard finally understood that he was the one who had been put down. The silence inside the Sterling estate was no longer heavy. For 10 years, the air in these hallways had been thick with tension, vibrating with the unspoken threat of Richard's temper. Every creak of the floorboards had been a warning. Every closed door had been a barrier. But on this Tuesday morning, the silence was different. It was the silence of a blank canvas waiting for the first stroke of paint. It was the stillness of a church after the congregation has left. I stood in the center of the great hall, wearing work boots and jeans. The suit I had worn to the mediation was gone, replaced by the uniform of my trade. I was not here as a landlord or an heir. I was here as a restorer. And this house was my most important project. I looked up at the windows. They were 12 feet high, intended to flood the space with the brilliant Newport sunlight. But for a decade, they had been choked by Richard's taste. He had installed heavy burgundy velvet drapes lined with gold tassels. They were ostentatious, dusty, and oppressive. They blocked the view of the ocean, turning the interior into a perpetual twilight. Richard loved them because they made the house feel like a fortress. He wanted to shut the world out. He wanted to control the environment just as he controlled the people inside it. I set up my ladder. It was an aluminum A-frame that echoed against the marble floor. I climbed to the top, the smell of stale dust filling my nose. I did not bother to unhook the curtains carefully. I reached for the heavy rod and pulled. With a sound like a tearing sail, the velvet came crashing down. Decades of accumulated dust billowed into the air, dancing in the sudden shaft of light that pierced the gloom. I moved to the next window, and the next. One by one, I stripped the house of its suffocating mask. The burgundy piles lay on the floor like the carcasses of slain beasts. I gathered them up in my arms, their weight surprisingly heavy, and carried them out to the dumpster I had rented. As I threw them in, I felt a physical weight lift from my own chest. The house was beginning to breathe again. I walked back inside and approached the glass. The windows had been painted shut years ago, a paranoid measure by a man who feared thieves more than he loved fresh air. I took a utility knife and carefully scored the paint along the sash. I worked with the precision of a surgeon, my hand steady. I placed the heels of my hands under the frame and pushed. With a loud crack, the seal broke. I pushed harder and the sash slid upward. The effect was instantaneous. The roar of the Atlantic Ocean rushed into the room. The salt air, cold and clean, swept through the foyer, chasing away the lingering odors of Richard's cheap cigars and Preston's cologne. The house seemed to sigh. The curtains began to flutter, not with the heavy sway of velvet, but with the light dance of the sheer linen panels I had found in the attic, the ones my mother had chosen 30 years ago. I moved from room to room, performing the same ritual. The library, the dining room, the solarium. In every room I opened the throat of the house. Sunlight hit corners that had been in shadow for a generation. It revealed the scuffs on the floor where Richard had paced. It showed the fade marks on the wallpaper where the fake paintings had hung. It showed the scars. But sunlight is the best disinfectant. It did not judge the damage, it simply illuminated the work that needed to be done. By noon, the house was flooded with light. It was blindingly bright. It was honest. Now it was time for the soul of the house to return. I went out to the driveway where the armored truck was waiting. 2 movers helped me unload the crates. These were not the hastily wrapped bundles Richard had tried to steal. These were custom-built, climate-controlled transport cases. I had paid for them myself years ago to protect the legacy. We carried them into the West Gallery. I dismissed the movers. This part I had to do alone. I pried open the first crate. The smell of cedar shavings wafted up. I reached in and lifted out the Winslow Homer. It was heavy, substantial. I held it up to the light. The brushstrokes were vigorous and alive. The colors were deep and resonant, unlike the flat acrylic of the replica. This painting had seen 2 world wars. It had survived the Great Depression, and it had survived Richard Sterling. I walked to the empty space on the wall. I did not just hang it. I checked the humidity. I checked the lux levels of the sunlight hitting the wall. I adjusted the wire. I hung it with the reverence of a priest placing a relic on an altar. When I stepped back, the room changed. The fake painting had been a placeholder, a lie designed to fool a fool. The real painting was a window into history. It anchored the room. It gave the space dignity. I moved to the Turner landscape, then the Rembrandt etching. As each piece returned to its rightful place, the house began to feel less like a crime scene and more like a home. The energy shifted. The frenetic, desperate vibe of Richard's tenure was replaced by a calm solidity. The art was not here to be sold. It was not here to be leveraged for debt. It was here to be seen. I spent hours walking through the rooms, adjusting frames, wiping down glass, aligning the sightlines. I was sweating, my shirt clinging to my back, but I had never felt more energized. I was scrubbing away the stain of their greed. I was reclaiming the narrative. In the late afternoon, I found myself in the master bedroom. This had been Richard's lair. It still smelled faintly of his bitterness. The bed was stripped bare. The closet was empty, save for a few wire hangers. I walked to the window and opened it wide. The view looked out over the cliffs down to the crashing waves below. I turned back to the room. I took the small portrait of my mother that Richard had hidden in a drawer face down. I wiped the dust from the glass. I hung it on the wall opposite the bed so she would be the first thing seen in the morning. I stood in the center of the room and listened. There was no shouting. There were no demands for money. There was no plotting. There was only the sound of the wind and the ocean. The house was no longer a weapon used to intimidate. It was no longer a vault used to hoard. It was just a house. I walked downstairs, my footsteps echoing on the clean floors. I stopped in the foyer and looked around. The light was turning golden as the sun began to set. The dust motes danced in the beams like tiny stars. The velvet was gone. The fakes were gone. The tyrants were gone. I walked to the front door and locked it. Not to keep people out, but to keep the peace in. I turned off the main lights, leaving only the soft glow of the security lamps on the art. I walked into the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the island, the same spot where Richard had collapsed, the same spot where the family had disintegrated. But I did not feel the ghosts. I just felt the warmth of the ceramic mug in my hands. The eviction was over. The occupation was finished. The house had been sick for a very long time, infected by a parasite of ego and greed. But today the fever had broken. I took a sip of tea and looked out at the darkening ocean. The restoration was complete. The house was healed, and for the first time in my life I was finally home. For decades, the iron gates of the Sterling estate were a warning. They told the world to keep out. They stood as a barrier between the wealthy elite on the hill and the working-class town below. But today those gates stand wide open, rusted hinges oiled and welcoming. The long driveway that was once forbidden territory is now lined with yellow school buses. I stood on the front porch watching a group of third graders spill out onto the gravel. They were loud and chaotic and full of energy. In the old days, Richard would have called the police if a child even touched the fence. Today I waved them inside. I had transformed the entire first floor of the mansion into the Sterling Public Gallery. It was the first private art collection in Newport to be completely free of charge. I watched as the children marched into the great hall, their eyes wide with wonder. They stared at the Winslow-Homer seascape pointing at the crashing waves. I saw a young boy with worn-out sneakers leaning in close to examine the brushwork on a Turner landscape. He was not looking at the price tag. He was looking at the magic. That was the difference between my father and me. Richard saw the art as a currency. I saw it as a conversation. I walked among them not as a lord of the manor in a bespoke suit, but as a guide in a simple button-down shirt. I did not want them to feel small in this big house. I wanted them to feel inspired. When a security guard tried to scold a girl for laughing too loud, I gently waved him off. "Let them laugh," I said. "This house has been quiet for too long." But the gallery was just the beginning. In the library where Richard and Preston had once plotted to poison my dog, I had set up the headquarters for the Silas Sterling Art Initiative. It was a scholarship fund dedicated to underprivileged children who had talent but no resources. We provided paints, canvases, and full college tuition for art programs. I was using the dividends from the trust not to buy sports cars or throw lavish parties, but to build a future for kids who had been told they were not good enough. I moved my personal living quarters to a modest suite on the second floor. I did not need the master bedroom. I did not need the servants or the bell to ring for tea. I cooked my own meals in the kitchen, often sharing coffee with the visiting art students who used the solarium as a studio. One afternoon, I found the boy with the worn sneakers sitting on the floor sketching the grand staircase. He looked up at me, terrified that he was in trouble. I sat down next to him on the marble floor. I looked at his sketchbook. It was rough, but the perspective was perfect. "You have a good eye," I told him. He looked around the massive foyer. "Do you own all this?" he asked. I looked at the paintings I had fought so hard to protect. I thought about the legal battles, the betrayal, and the empty victory of revenge. I realized then that ownership is an illusion. You cannot own beauty. You can only take care of it for a little while. "No," I said, smiling. "I do not own it. I am just the guardian. I am just keeping it safe for you." The boy smiled back and kept drawing. The house was filled with the scratching of charcoal on paper and the murmur of learning. The ghost of the tyrant had been exorcised not by a priest, but by the laughter of children. The eviction was complete. The fortress had fallen, and in its place a sanctuary had risen. It has been exactly 365 days since the champagne glass shattered on the floor of the Great Hall. The anniversary of the eviction. Tonight the driveway is full again, but there are no black limousines idling in the circle. There are bicycles leaning against the hedges and hybrid cars parked on the grass. The air is not filled with the polite, hushed whispers of the elite pretending to like each other. It is filled with the chaotic, vibrant sound of jazz music and genuine laughter. I hosted a gala tonight not to celebrate a wedding anniversary or a business merger, but to unveil the first student exhibition of the Silas Sterling Art Initiative. The house was alive. The crystal chandeliers that Richard had used to intimidate his guests now illuminated the finger paintings of 7-year-olds and the charcoal sketches of high school students who had never held a real artist's pencil before today. The waiters were not terrified servants. They were local college kids, earning tuition and joking with the guests. I stepped out onto the front porch to get a breath of the cool Atlantic air. The noise of the party faded slightly behind me, replaced by the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the cliffs. I walked down the stone steps, enjoying the solitude. I looked toward the main gate. The iron bars were open, welcoming the town inside. But then I saw him. Standing just beyond the pool of light cast by the security lamps was a solitary figure. He was wearing a coat that was too thin for the weather and leaning heavily on a cane. He did not step onto the gravel. He stayed in the shadows on the public side of the fence. It was Richard. He looked older. The year had carved deep lines into his face and his posture was stooped, the arrogance finally crushed under the weight of his reality. He was watching the house. He was watching the light spill out from the windows he used to command. He saw the people laughing in his library. He saw the life he had tried to suffocate blooming without him. For a moment I felt a phantom twinge of the old fear, the instinct to straighten my tie and apologize. But it passed as quickly as it came, replaced by a quiet calm. I did not hate him. Hate requires energy, and I had none left to give him. Richard saw me. He froze. His hand tightened on the gate, as if he were about to push it open and demand entry, as if he were about to scream that this was his house. But he didn't. He looked at me, and for the first time in 30 years I saw shame in his eyes. He knew he didn't belong here. He knew that the warmth inside was something he had forfeited. I did not walk down to meet him. I did not invite him in for a drink. That chapter was closed and the ink was dry. Instead, I looked him in the eye across the distance. I gave him a single slow nod. It was not a gesture of friendship. It was not an invitation. It was an acknowledgement. I was telling him that I saw him. I was telling him that I survived him. And I was telling him goodbye. Richard lowered his head. He understood. He turned slowly, his cane tapping against the pavement, and began the long walk back to the bus stop. He did not look back. I turned around and walked back up the stairs. I placed my hand on the heavy oak door. I could hear the music swelling inside, the sound of a future that belonged to me. I stepped across the threshold into the light and pulled the door shut behind me. The lock clicked into place with a sound that was final and absolute. The tyrant was gone. The guardian was home. And the house was finally at peace. The story of the Sterling estate is a powerful reminder that true legacy is defined by character, not by the name on a deed. Richard and Preston believed that power was loud. They thought that authority came from shouting, spending, and intimidating those around them. They made the fatal mistake of confusing silence with weakness and kindness with stupidity. They underestimated Ethan because he didn't play their game of ego. He played the long game of integrity. Ultimately, this is a story about the difference between ownership and stewardship. Richard wanted to own the house to hide from the world and feed his narcissism. He treated the art, the money, and even his own son as possessions to be used and discarded. Ethan, however, understood that we are merely guardians of the things we have. By choosing to protect the art and share it with the public, he turned a mausoleum of greed into a sanctuary of learning. The tragic downfall of the Sterling family proves that you cannot build a life on a foundation of lies and exploitation. When you burn bridges to keep yourself warm, you eventually run out of fuel and find yourself stranded in the cold. Richard lost his home not because of a legal technicality, but because he was morally bankrupt long before he was financially bankrupt. The most satisfying justice is not revenge. It is simply letting toxic people face the consequences of their own actions while you move forward into the light. If you enjoyed seeing justice finally served and want more stories about the underdogs taking back their power, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now.